Imagine waking up to find your electric bill has mysteriously skyrocketed, only to discover that your HOA Karen neighbor has been stealing your electricity, right from your own outlet. And when you catch her red-handed, she calls the cops on you. Sounds insane, right? Well, buckle up because this isn't just another petty HOA dispute. This is war. And by the time it's over, Karen's reign of terror will come crashing down in the most satisfying way possible. Stay tuned because this is one HOA nightmare you won't believe. Hello beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. The neighborhood was the kind you'd see in a real estate commercial. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and an air of quiet suburbia that made you wonder if anything interesting ever happened there. It was peaceful, predictable, and most importantly, my home. And then there was Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, armed with a clipboard, a permanent scowl, and an unshakable belief that she single-handedly kept the community from descending into chaos. With every exaggerated sigh and dramatic finger-pointing, she made it her mission to enforce the HOA rules, both real and imaginary, as if she were a one-woman suburban police force. She had an uncanny ability to appear at the worst possible moments. Washing your car? She'd pop up with a rule about water usage. Mowing the lawn? She'd inspect the grass length like a royal gardener. Even something as innocent as a garden gnome could trigger her wrath. "Excuse me," she said one afternoon, arms crossed as she stood in my driveway. "That gnome is not HOA compliant." I glanced at the tiny ceramic gnome by my flower bed. It was hardly offensive, just a cheerful little guy with a shovel. "Since when does the HOA have rules about gnomes?" I asked. Karen's lips pursed. "Since now. It disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic." I bit back a laugh. It's a gnome, not a neon sign. But logic and Karen were two parallel lines that would never meet. This was the beginning of what would become an all-out war. At the time, I thought it was just another one of Karen's ridiculous power trips. A minor annoyance, a petty inconvenience. What I didn't realize was that Karen was about to take things to a whole new level. And this time it wasn't about gnomes or grass or mailboxes. This time she was stealing my electricity. It started small, as all ridiculous things do. Karen had always been a stickler for the rules, except when it came to herself. She strutted around the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, barking orders at anyone who dared step out of line. The problem was, the line only existed in her mind. One day I found a violation notice taped to my front door. The reason? Improper driveway cleanliness. I stared at the paper, confused. My driveway looked perfectly fine. No oil stains, no trash, not even a stray leaf. And yet, when I looked up, Karen was standing across the street, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. "Karen," I called out. "What exactly is improper driveway cleanliness?" She marched over, huffing. "There's dust." "Dust?" She nodded, dead serious. "Yes, and dust can lead to dirt, which leads to grime, which leads to—" I held up a hand. "Hey, got it. You want me to mop my driveway? If you care about property values, yes." I knew arguing was useless. Karen thrived on confrontation the way plants thrived on sunlight. The best thing to do was ignore her and move on with my life. But Karen didn't believe in being ignored. A few days later, I noticed my electric bill had skyrocketed. At first, I thought maybe I'd just left something running overnight. But as I stood outside one evening taking out the trash, I saw it. A thick, bright orange extension cord snaking out from my outdoor outlet, straight into Karen's yard. I blinked. There was no way. No way she was actually— oh, but she was. I followed the cord with my eyes. It led directly into her garage, where a large humming freezer sat stocked with who knows what. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky about it. I marched over, unplugging the cord in one swift motion. A few seconds later, her front door flew open. "Excuse me." Karen stormed out, eyes wide with fake outrage. "Excuse you," I shot back. "You're stealing my electricity." She scoffed as if I'd just accused her of robbing a bank. "I'm borrowing it. This is a shared community, you know." I stared at her. "That's not how electricity works." She crossed her arms. "As a board member of the HOA, I have certain privileges." I couldn't help but laugh. "Oh, so the HOA says you can plug into my house?" She huffed. "Not explicitly, but—" I cut her off. Yeah, no. That's theft. It is not, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Besides, what kind of neighbor refuses to help another neighbor? I pointed at her garage. Karen, you have a fully stocked deep freezer plugged into my house. That's not help, that's stealing. She narrowed her eyes. Fine. Be that way. But don't expect the HOA to be on your side when I bring this up. And with that she stomped inside and slammed the door. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because the next morning I woke up to 3 violation notices taped to my door. I pulled the stack of violation notices off my door, already knowing who was behind them. Unauthorized lawn ornament. Trash bins not aligned perfectly with the curb. Exterior light too bright. I sighed. Karen was nothing if not predictable. She must have been fuming all night, plotting ways to punish me for daring to unplug her personal power supply. And now she was flexing her so-called HOA authority, trying to bury me in ridiculous citations. Fine. 2 could play this game. I grabbed my phone and did some digging. HOA rules were public records, and if Karen wanted to use them against me, I figured it was time to see just how well she was following her own regulations. As it turned out, not well at all. Her fence was too tall. Her flower beds extended past the HOA's approved dimensions, and best of all, her garage door color was not officially sanctioned. Oh, the irony. The next time she stomped over, brandishing another complaint, I smiled. Hey Karen. Did you know your garage door is actually violating HOA code? She blinked. What? I held up my phone. Yeah. Section 5, paragraph C. It says garage doors need to be a shade of white or neutral beige. Yours is, well, definitely not beige. Her face twitched. That rule is outdated. I shrugged. Still in the handbook. Maybe you should issue yourself a violation notice. For the first time ever she was speechless. I should have stopped there, but Karen had been making my life miserable for weeks. So, the next morning when I saw her walking toward my house with that clipboard of doom, I decided to have a little fun. I set up a tiny, harmless decoy violation. Something just annoying enough to drive her crazy. A single pink lawn flamingo. Right in the middle of my yard. I sat back on my porch with my coffee and waited. It took less than 5 minutes. Karen froze in place, staring at it like it had personally insulted her family. Her fingers twitched around her clipboard. She stalked up my driveway in record time, already mid-rant. That is not HO approved. Before she could finish, I held up my phone. Recording. She stopped short. Karen, do you know what this looks like? I asked, my voice dripping with amusement. She blinked rapidly. A harassment complaint. Her mouth opened and closed, but she said nothing. I let the silence hang in the air before taking a sip of my coffee. Enjoy your day, Karen. And with that she turned on her heel and stormed off, without a single violation notice left behind. Victory? Not quite. Because if I knew Karen, this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Later that evening I took a casual stroll down the street, partly to clear my head and partly to see if anyone else had been caught in Karen's ridiculous web of HOA tyranny. I didn't have to look far. Near the mailbox cluster, a small group of neighbors had gathered, whispering in hushed but urgent tones. At the center of the group was Tom from next door, looking particularly agitated. When he saw me, he waved me over. You're not gonna believe this. Oh, I believe anything at this point, I muttered. She tried to find me again, he said. Guess what for? I shrugged. Grass too green? Door too door-shaped? Tom rubbed his temples. She accused my cat of trespassing. I blinked. Your cat? Yeah. He pointed at his front yard where his orange tabby sat grooming itself, blissfully unaware of its criminal status. She left a notice saying my pet was unauthorized and disruptive. Another neighbor, Dan, chuckled. She's losing it. She left me a complaint about my porch light being too bright for community standards. I raised a brow. Wait, wasn't that one of mine? Dan nodded. Yeah, she's recycling violations now. Just changing the names. That got a laugh from the group. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she was harassing. Last week she complained about my trash cans, said Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Said they weren't aligned perfectly with the curb. They weren't, her husband Mr. Johnson cut in with a smirk. They were exactly 1 inch off. The horror. The group chuckled, but there was an underlying frustration beneath the laughter. Karen had gone unchecked for too long. "She's getting worse," Dan said. "I swear she sits in her window with binoculars just waiting to pounce." "She has a literal binder of violations," Tom added. "I saw it once at a meeting. She had it labeled, neighborhood offenders." "Sounds like a hit list," I muttered. "Pretty much. The worst part, nobody wanted to stand up to her directly." "She has friends on the HOA board," Mrs. Johnson said, shaking her head. "No one wants to be next on her list." I sighed, rubbing my temples. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had turned the neighborhood into her personal dictatorship. And if no one else was willing to push back, I guess it was going to have to be me. I decided it was time to fight back, not with shouting matches or petty revenge, but with something Karen truly feared: cold, hard evidence. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to document everything. Every time she marched onto someone's property to measure their grass with her ridiculous little ruler, recorded. Every time she taped one of her fake violation notices to someone's door, photographed. Every time she trespassed or tampered with anything that wasn't hers, logged and time-stamped. The best part? I wasn't alone. Tom set up a motion camera facing his yard. Dan did the same. Even Mr. and Mrs. Johnson got in on it, keeping a notepad of every ridiculous complaint she issued. And just as expected, Karen escalated. She must have realized I wasn't backing down, because suddenly she was everywhere. One morning I caught her standing in my front yard, measuring my grass. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" She jumped, then immediately masked it with a haughty expression. "Your grass is 0.2 inches taller than HOA regulation." I stared. "There is no HOA regulation about grass height." "There is now," she sniffed, jotting something down on her clipboard. I laughed. "You can't just make up rules." "As an HOA board member, I can enforce community standards," she shot back. "And you are not in compliance." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen faltered. What are you doing?" "Documenting," I said casually. "I figured the HOA would love to see how you enforce these rules." She turned on her heel and stomped off without another word. That was when I knew she was getting desperate. And desperate people make bad decisions. The next evening she called the cops on me. The police incident. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the chaos-free silence, when flashing red and blue lights pulled into my driveway. A cop stepped out, looking bored and mildly annoyed. "You the homeowner?" he asked. I nodded. "Yep. What's going on?" Before he could answer, Karen came storming across the street. "There he is," she shrieked. "He's been stealing from the H." The officer blinked. "Stealing?" "Yes. He's illegally using neighborhood resources." I stared at her, genuinely baffled. "What resources?" She crossed her arms. "Electricity." I nearly choked. The officer sighed and turned to me. "Sir, do you have any idea what she's talking about?" "Oh, I do," I said. "But it's actually the other way around." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to my video library and hit play. Karen's own extension cord theft played out in glorious high definition. The officer watched, his expression deadpan. When the video ended, he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, is this you?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's taken out of context." The cop raised an eyebrow. "What's the context?" I was just, it's community property." The cop sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am, you do realize that's literally theft, right?" Karen turned bright red. "This is an outrage." I suggest you take this up with the HO," the officer said, clearly done with her nonsense. "And stop wasting police resources on neighbor disputes." With that, he got back in his car and drove off, leaving Karen fuming in my driveway. She spun to me, her eyes blazing. "You think this is funny?" I smirked. "A little." She let out an actual screech and stormed back to her house. I watched her go, knowing this was it. She was unraveling. And she had no idea what was coming next. The next HOA meeting was a full house. Word had spread fast about Karen's latest meltdown, and for the first time in a long time, the neighbors had had enough. The usual small, boring meeting room was packed. People stood against the walls, whispering amongst themselves, while the HOA board members, most of them Karen's friends, sat at the front, looking visibly uncomfortable. Karen, on the other hand, was smug. She sat in the center, clipboard in hand, probably expecting to turn this into another power grab. But she had no idea what was coming. The meeting started with its usual boring agenda items. But then, right when Karen was about to launch into another speech about neighborhood standards, I stood up. "I have something to add to the agenda," I said loudly. Karen scowled. "This isn't the time for..." The HOA president held up a hand. "What's the issue?" I took a deep breath and turned on my phone. "It's about abuse of HOA power. Specifically, one board member," I gestured toward Karen, "who's been harassing homeowners, making up rules, trespassing on properties, and even stealing electricity." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen froze. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "I have done no such thing." I smiled and hit play. The first video rolled. Karen stealing electricity. Gasps filled the room. Karen's face drained of color. The second clip. Karen trespassing to measure people's lawns. The third. Karen slapping fake violation notices on houses at 2 a.m. The HOA president looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. "This is insane." Tom stood up. "She fined me over my cat. She tried to tell me my flowers work too bright." Mrs. Johnson added. "She peeks into people's yards like a creep." Dan shouted. Karen's head snapped around wildly as the room turned against her. I was only trying to maintain standards," she stammered. The HOA president cleared his throat. "Karen, do you have an explanation for this behavior?" Karen grasped at straws. "I was just enforcing rules." "The electricity theft wasn't a rule," I said. The HOA president rubbed his temples. "Karen, you've been a valued member of the HOA, but..." Someone from the back cut him off. "Kick her out." Karen's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" More voices joined in. "She's out of control. We didn't elect her to be a dictator. She needs to be removed." A vote was called right then and there. The result: unanimous. Karen was officially removed from her position on the HOA board. For the first time ever, she was powerless. And then came the final cherry on top. The HOA president, now looking fed up, sighed and flipped through his own rulebook. "Karen," he said, "we also have a report that your garage door color is non-compliant." A wave of laughter spread through the room. Karen's jaw dropped. "But..." He held up his hand. "You'll be receiving a formal violation notice. You'll need to repaint it within 30 days or you'll be fined." Karen was speechless. I sat back in my chair, arms crossed, watching the downfall unfold with pure satisfaction. Sweet karma. Karen never recovered from her downfall. The day after the HOA meeting, she was noticeably absent from her usual patrols. No more clipboard in hand, no more exaggerated sighs over imaginary violations. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Her reign of terror had ended. Over the next few weeks, a miraculous transformation took place. Neighbors who had once been afraid to step out of line started decorating their houses freely. Dan put up a bright blue birdhouse that Karen had once called an eyesore. Tom let his cat roam freely without fear of a fine. Mrs. Johnson planted the brightest, most obnoxiously pink flowers she could find. Me. I left my pink lawn flamingo right where it was. Just for good measure. Karen, however, wasn't handling her fall from grace well. At first, she tried to file an appeal to get back on the board. It was denied immediately. Then she started spamming the HOA email list with complaints, but since she no longer had any actual authority, they were ignored. One afternoon, I saw her standing on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at the neighborhood like a queen without a throne. And then just like that, she vanished. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up. By the end of the month, she was gone. I don't know where she went. Honestly, I don't care. What I do know is that from that day forward, the neighborhood was Karen-free. No more bogus fines. No more surprise inspections. No more clipboard of doom. Just peace, quiet, and the sweet, sweet victory of knowing she had finally been beaten at her own game. As I sat on my porch one evening, sipping a well-earned drink, Tom strolled by with his cat in tow. "Well," he said, grinning. "Guess we can all sleep easy now." I nodded. Yep. The grass is greener, the mailboxes stand taller. And we've all learned how to keep our driveways Karen-proof. And with that, life in the neighborhood returned to normal.